This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Will Carr is joined by Paul Fagan to discuss At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien, a novel Anthony Burgess called A Book About Writing a Book About Writing a Book. At Swim Two Birds is narrated by a young undergraduate student who invents wild stories featuring a host of strange characters. The novel consists of three of the students' seemingly unlinked stories that introduce characters such as Furriskey, who is a fictional character created by the equally fictional Trellis, a writer of westerns. As the narrative progresses, the students' characters seem to take on a life of their own, and the novel becomes an absurdist brew of Irish folklore, farce, and comedic satire. Flann O'Brien was born Brian O'Nolan in County Tyrone, Ireland in 1911. After studying at University College Dublin, he joined the Irish Civil Service, during which time he wrote novels both in English and Irish Gaelic, scripts for television and theatre, and newspaper columns under the name Miles na Goplin. He died in 1966. Paul Fagan is a Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow at Maynooth University, where he's working on the Irish Research Council project Celibacy in Irish Women's Writing, 1860s to 1950s. He's co-founder of the International Flann O'Brien Society and a founding general editor of the Journal of Flann O'Brien Studies. He is the co-editor of books Finnegan's Wake, Human and Non-Human Histories, Irish Modernisms, Gaps, Conjectures, Possibilities, and 5 edited volumes on Flann O'Brien. Head to the episode description for all the relevant links and a list of all the books mentioned. Here's Will Carr, who interviewed Paul Fagan about At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien in September 2024.
Well, welcome to this edition of the International Anthony Burgess Foundation 99 Novels podcast. We're delighted to have Paul Fagan with us, who is an expert on Flann O'Brien, and we're going to be talking about Flann O'Brien's 1939 novel At Swim Two Birds. Welcome, Paul. Really nice to see you here.
Great. Thank you, Will. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Let's start, rather than with Anthony Burgess, let's start with you. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you first came to Flann O'Brien's work, and then maybe a bit about what you made of it. And in particular, this novel. What were your first impressions of At Swim Two Birds?
Yeah, well, thanks. This is a nice question because I've had a long history with this novel. I first read At Swim Two Birds as a teenager, growing up in the Irish Midlands in the 1990s, when I found it among my mother's old books, caught my attention for whatever reason, and I read it. And I'm sure I didn't quite get the object of its satire or all the references to early Irish poetry. But as a teenager, I was immediately sort of charmed by its eccentricity, by its humour. I quickly sought out all of Flann O'Brien's other major works, The Third Policeman, On Bell Bucht, The Hard Life, Ducky Archive, Best of Miles. And yeah, I was hooked. I became a fan for life. Probably shaped my sense of humour and my interest in absurd, experimental comic literature and everything else. But I also think it captured my imagination because, growing up in the Irish Midlands, it's a very flat place. It can be a bit dull. And it was quite interesting to see this kind of world because the novel's title, At Swim Two Birds, It's based on a place called Flann, which is the ford of the two birds, where the character of Sweeney stops at one point. And that's quite close to where I grew up. That's quite close to Athlone. So it was really amazing and fascinating as a teenager to see what I saw as this sort of banal rural Midlands transformed into this very comic, anarchic, and disruptive kind of text world. So yeah, I became a fan for life and set up the Flann O'Brien Society, the journal, organized conferences around his work, all initiated by this initial encounter, I suppose, with his work.
Did you ever talk to your mother about it? I mean, what was it doing on the shelves in your house?
No, I've often talked to my mother about it. My mother's a great reader, so I'm very happy for that influence on my own, formative influence on my own life. Yeah, I spoke to her about it a lot. I talked to her about it, and she had read it when she was a university student in UCD, where Flann O'Brien also studied. And she didn't have a perfect memory of the plot, but she remembered the feelings. Like, she remembered it being very funny, and she remembered the thing that stood out for her was like a long discussion of the best way to remove boils. That's what it's kind of stuck in her head, which is quite funny. And she grew up in a time where Flann O'Brien would have been quite prominent on the stage and the screen. When my mother went to college in Dublin, was part of a renaissance of Flann O'Brien's work in the 70s, where he was staged a lot by people like Eamon Morrissey. There was a lot of television and radio adaptations of his work. So he would have been quite prominent or having a kind of a renaissance at that time too. But yeah, my mum has a good taste in books.
By the time you got to it, though, was Flann O'Brien much around? Or put it another way, when was the first time you met somebody else who'd read At Swim Two Birds, do you think?
Oh my God, this is a good question. Certainly when I read it, the only person I had met was my mum. And probably it was when I went to UCD, when I went to college in UCD at the end of the 90s was probably the first time I met people who had read it, who were interested in it. I mean, this is all part of the thing, right? I mean, I like when I went to school, a lot of the people I went to school with had no interest in reading books. And so it was this kind of secret pleasure and hobby and whatever that I had until I went to college and met like-minded people. And then, of course, I started off as a Joycean, and I went to a Joyce symposium in Prague in 2010. And there I met Ruben Borg, who had like a similar sort of passion for O'Brien's works as I had. And it was sort of with him that we conspired to have the first Flann O'Brien conference, to set up the society, to set up the journal, and so on. So I guess it was through academia in some ways that I got to know or came to realize that there was a lot of people who had shared this experience or this interest in his work and sustained interest in his writing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the experience of At Swim Two Birds. And you described some of its qualities, its comedy and the way in which it talks about parts of Ireland that are familiar to you. But the plot does resist a summary, I would say. But I wondered if, for the benefit of listeners who might not have read it, maybe you could give that a quick go, or maybe more generally just tell us what it's about and what we might expect to find in it.
Yeah, sure. I can give it the old college try, I suppose. In his piece on At Swim Two Birds, Burgess describes the plot as follows. I have a quote from it here. There is a narrator who's writing a book about a man called Trellis, who's writing a book about other people who are writing various books about a man called Trellis. So, yeah, without hanging a lot of details on it, I think Burgess's description gets at the key fact that the novel's plot is this very kind of mise en abîme, falling into the void like story of the conflict between authors and their creations. And it's quite complex because it has these different ontological layers, right, that keep going down. There's Flann O'Brien, who's writing this book about an author, this Dublin-based student narrator, who is writing this manuscript about the tyrannical author Dermot Trellis, who is writing these kinds of cowboy books, and he's hiring and exploiting the labor of characters from other stories like Finn McCool from the Irish Fenian Cycles and these kind of stock cowboy characters and so on. And when these characters are not being used in Trellis's writing, they're sort of just hanging around the Red Swan Hotel, falling in love and having these very long, banal conversations, like the one my mother remembered about how the best way to remove boils and this type of thing, until eventually they decide to rebel against Trellis by drugging him so that they can have more free time when he's asleep. But what happens is that the different levels of the novel start to cross-contaminate. So there's a scene in which Trellis rapes a female character from his fiction, and they produce this kind of half-author, half-literary fictional offspring, Orlick Trellis. And Orlick leads the characters in this kind of rebellion against his father, Dermot, by writing a novel about him, having this mythical creature, the puka, torture Dermot Trellis endlessly. He puts them on this kind of mock show trial before all of the characters that he's abused and neglected. And these include this kind of non-corporeal good fairy. There's a talking cow who goes on the stand to testify that Trellis has neglected her milking, which has left her in a lot of pain and things like this. So these kind of very heightened passages are interpolated with scenes from the student narrator's daily life, which involves drinking and carousing and writing, avoiding university classes, and his sort of resentments against his petty bourgeois uncle that he lives with. And the novel keeps alternating between these sort of banal and elevated comic scenes, these different ontological levels, until it arrives at this quite stark and quite open conclusion or terminus. So in terms of just sort of the tone of the book and what to expect beyond the plot, I suppose I would describe it as primarily this kind of very anarchic, rebellious, Carnivalesque kind of Irish modernist comic novel. Burgess identifies Sterne, Rabelais, Joyce as points of comparison. I think these are really good points of comparison, and I think we'll unpack these in a bit more detail a little later in our conversation. But yeah, in short, it sort of combines a deep knowledge of early Middle Irish poetry and a humorous handling of the place of Irish traditional writing in modern Ireland, mixes this with a kind of Joycean modernism, but it's sort of aping of Joycean avant-garde experimentalism is always tinged, I think, with a little bit of a conservative wit. There's also a kind of a dissatisfaction with the banality of Irish modernity, and even a sort of skepticism regarding Joycean modernism as a way of negotiating these cultural politics, even as O'Brien obviously very clearly has an admiration for the comic potential of Joycean formal experimentation. And in these regards, it's also clearly a very metafictional book, by which I mean it's a book about the process of writing a book. It's literature about what literature is. It's a kind of a palimpsest in this way. So as well as being very funny to a certain sense of humor, I think you could also think of it as also a more serious reflection on what stories are, how we tell stories, how the telling of stories influences our relationship to history, our national identity, things like this.
Yes, absolutely. A book about writing a book. Well, it's a book about writing a book about writing a book. There are many layers to it, aren't there? As you say, a palimpsest. My sense of it was that all these layers are held in tension as well. You know, that I didn't get the feeling that one was the real story, particularly. There was, you know, you could spend time with each of them and draw out different things from them, but they were all a part of the whole that were essential for a proper conception of the total novel. But your description there was quite wide ranging, and one of the things Burgess says in the review you mentioned is that the book is sometimes difficult, that it's quite a challenging thing to get through, to read. He also describes it as whimsical, though, and as no literary heavyweight. So describing it as, giving the impression that it can be quite light as well. I wondered if you had anything to say about that, and maybe if you could advise somebody approaching the book, what would be some good ways of attempting to engage with That Swim Two Birds?
So yeah, this is very interesting. This is a very good question. In my capacity as a university lecturer and as organizer of a lot of events for the Flann O'Brien Society and public-facing events, I've faced a lot of different reactions to the book. Everything from, love to annoyance and frustration to humor and everything. I think it's a book that willfully elicits a lot of these different reactions. In terms of the difficulty of the book, I've noted three main areas of difficulty that students or readers tend to have with it. The first of these is the difficulty at the level of the plot, which I think we've just been talking about there previously, it gets very convoluted because you're at all these different levels of reality. Can get confusing where you are at different points. But there's also a difficulty I've noticed, especially with my students or with non-Irish readers, at the level of the references, the allusions to Irish mythical writing and other texts, especially the long Finn McCool passages, the long passages from The Frenzy of Sweeney, and references to Joyce and Huxley. I think a lot of readers can be not familiar with these texts, and they can be quite long. So part of the humor of the Finn McCool passages is that they're so extended and they're so long-winded and they're so unnecessarily verbose and repetitive. But perhaps without a knowledge of these texts, it's difficult to get what the humor is or to understand the references. And this leads into what I think is like the third, but probably the most interesting difficulty, which is identifying the targets of the satire. So there's a lot of different potential targets of satire. There's these long-winded Finn McCool passages. There's these very sparse quotes from early Irish poetry, like The Frenzy of Sweeney. But then there's also like these kind of modern working class poets who turn up, like Jem Casey, who writes this poem, The Workman's Friend, the refrain of which is "A pint of plain is your only man." So this poem and this refrain seems to have been sort of embraced by a lot of people in Irish culture. It's very often repeated. But I think often this embrace of this fails to really notice that the novel is satirizing this as a kind of piece of banal doggerel. And I think it's hard also to note then that a lot of the references to, say, this medieval Sweeney poetry is quite sincere and quite loving and quite affectionate, even though it's treated humorously. So in the novel, everything is treated humorously, but there are some things like the English translation of Irish poetry or kind of banal modern attempts to write poetry, which are the subject of derision in the way that other parts of the book are not. And the lack of it, kind of a knowledge of reference, can make it quite difficult to identify these points of satire. But this is also related to the structural experimentation of the book, because I think the reader's always having the rug pulled out from under them as they progress. And so never quite sure where you stand in relation to the plot, but also in relation to the book's intentions and its kind of comic targets and so on. So some of these difficulties are more easy to overcome than others, I guess. But if readers can, learn to smile rather than frown, there's a lot of humor, a lot of reflections on the art of novel writing that could be very engaging and rewarding if you're happy to read books that are not committed to realism and things like this.
Well, yes. Yeah, joining in the joke, and not taking oneself too seriously when you're reading it, I think is quite important, because the novel doesn't take itself. I mean, it is serious, but it's also not. And perhaps we'll talk about that in a moment too. But giving yourself a chance. I, for example, wouldn't claim any knowledge of medieval Irish poetry, but just letting those passages happen, it's possible to get something out of them.
Yeah. When I was young, going back to, you've sort of like evoked all these Proustian memories in me now by asking me that first question. But when I was young, I remember being also very interested in Finnegan's Wake. And I remember being very influenced by Burgess's writing on Finnegan's Wake, because his attitude about it was, don't be so glum, it's funny. You don't take it so seriously. There's stuff on every page to enjoy if you can just sort of have the right attitude towards the text. And I think this is advice that would also keep you in good stead if you're reading It Swim to Birds for the first time.
Let's talk a little bit about Flann O'Brien, or rather Brian O'Nolan himself, the writer, because Burgess writes a little bit about meeting Brian O'Nolan in 1966, and he describes him as small and neat and drinking hard and concerned with the niceties of Dublin speech. I wondered if you, though, could tell us a bit about the writer himself or his many selves. Who was he? And, why did he write a book like this? Where did he get his inspiration from?
Yes, Burgess has this very nice little rhetorical flourish at the end of his piece that you're alluding to there, I think, where he refers to O'Brien's his selves. So he's alluding to the fact that in this supposed figure of Flann O'Brien, there are multiple people and multiple personae. And the fact that Flann O'Brien is not in fact Flann O'Brien, but Flann O'Brien is only one of many pseudonyms that were used by the author. So the biographical author was born Brian O'Nolan, or Brian O'Nulon, to use his Irish name, or Brian Nolan. So, he has three names to begin with, even before he starts messing around with pseudonyms. And Brian O'Nolan was born in Strabane in County Tyrone, Ireland, in 1911. He was raised in an Irish-speaking household. But important to note here that he doesn't grow up in the Gaeltacht region. He grows up in an area where Irish would not have been necessarily spoken. So it was an ideological commitment by his parents, by his father, to raise the children speaking Irish. And he grows up with his mother's family, the Gormleys, and his father's family, the O'Nolans, with a very creative extended family. So he had uncles who wrote for the Abbey Theatre, uncles who were major Irish language scholars, relatives who were musicians, this type of thing. And his father, Michael Vincent O'Nolan, was an official in the British Customs Service. And this was a role that obviously required frequent moves. So the family was based in Strabane, but moved to Glasgow for a brief period, the Irish Midlands, Tullamore, eventually settling in Dublin. And for that reason, O'Brien stays there and he assumes this sort of Dublin persona or character. And for that reason, he becomes known as a Dublin writer and he's often thought of in these ways. I think his roots in the north of Ireland and his connections to the Irish language are worth keeping in mind, especially when thinking about the influences on writing a novel like It Swim to Birds. So once he's in Dublin, he goes to University College Dublin at UCD, where he writes his MA thesis on nature poetry in Irish. And he becomes part of a group of local UCD writers like Niall Montgomery and people like this, who write in this very absurdist and kind of, I suppose, rambunctious style, producing these short-lived magazines, these kind of comic, experimental, satirical magazines like Blather. And this kind of collaborative spirit is a big part of this early phase of his writing. In the late 1930s, he starts writing, him and his group of friends, his clique, sort of start writing these satirical letters to the Irish Times, these non-serious kind of hoaxing letters to the editor of the Irish Times under pen names like Velvet Texture, Whit Cassidy, Hilda Upshot, things like this. So already you have this kind of multiplication into different voices, different persona, and so on. But obviously he's most well known by the two pseudonyms that he would use in probably what we could think of as like the second phase of his career and the most successful one. As Flann O'Brien, he writes a series of modernist novels that are quite experimental, At Swim to Birds, but also The Third Policeman. And as Miles Nagopoline, he starts to write a column for the Irish Times. He writes plays for the stage in Dublin. He writes sitcoms for the Irish National Broadcaster later in life. But as Burgess also notes, as all of this is happening, he also has a parallel career in the Irish civil service, which, he very quickly went through the ranks in the Irish civil service, becoming private secretary to various ministers. And this conflict between the official part of his life and the kind of more anarchic writing part of his life is very interesting as well, and perhaps instructive. And then what led him to write a crazy book like this? I don't know. I mean, it's part of the humor of the group. It's part of his interest in disrupting the staid kind of realist norms of literature in the Irish Free State. It's his dissatisfaction with literature in Ireland and attitudes to the Irish literary tradition. I mean, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think it's sort of comparable to Swift, when Swift writes A Tale of a Tub, right? He is mocking these modern trends with a kind of conservative wit, but in the process producing a kind of new modern way of writing the novel or of literature.
The difference, I suppose, between Brian O'Nolan as a bureaucrat, as a civil servant, and Flann O'Brien as an experimental novelist is quite stark. But actually, it's quite interesting to think about how that is not a difference at all. You know, the bureaucratic language that appears at points in his novel writing, and who knows, maybe his anarchic approach to being a civil servant too. You know, Burgess refers to his high wit and his slightly disruptive influence among his colleagues. It's quite instructive, I think, to think about how his persona might have manifested in different contexts.
Yeah, and I think it is also important to recognize in this context that the Irish civil service at this point was a hotbed of writers and creative figures. It was basically kind of like, in some ways, a kind of a patronage for Irish writers. I think often people think that Brian O'Nolan was a secretary in the civil service, and that means that he must have been very frustrated with this banal daily desk job. But the reality would have been quite different. It would have been moving with very intellectual literary types who would have had the same interests in Joyce and so on. And you know, he would have been involved at all kinds of levels of Irish cultural and political life, which I think would have also interested and fascinated him.
In his writing about Flann O'Brien, Burgess returns to an idea of Irishness, which he refuses to define, probably quite sensibly, but he talks about it really in relation to comedy and also, as we've touched on already, Irish history and myth and poetry. I just wondered what you thought about that, though. I mean, is Irishness a useful way of thinking about O'Brien? And I was put it another way, where does O'Brien fit into a conception of Irish writing? We've already talked about Joyce, and there are other writers too, but I wondered where O'Brien fits into a story about Irishness and Irish literature.
It's certainly one of the things that stood out to me the most immediately the first time I read Burgess's piece about O'Brien. And one of the aspects of it that I found the most fascinating is his recurrent insistence on O'Brien's Irishness, that Irishness is the driving force that produces him to write in this kind of madcap, humorous, whimsical but difficult style. And of course, as you allude to, he's careful not to really define what he means by Irishness, although I think there are hints throughout the piece. You know, of course, we have to be cautious when using a term like Irishness in any kind of essentialist or uninterrogated way. And there is a tendency, I find, in a lot of 20th century modernist criticism, to which I suppose Burgess is also a key figure, to play up this kind of stage Irish quality in Irish writing. This idea that what is Irish about certain kinds of literature is its resistance to facts, to reason, to truth-telling, the sort of idea of the Irish bull, untrustworthiness, the slipperiness of the Irish. And maybe the most famous example of this is Hugh Kenner's book, A Colder Eye, from I think like 1982 or whatever. And there he characterizes Irish literature as sort of this dedication to the Irish fact, which is what he thinks of as this kind of this like ostentation, this kind of maddening ostentation of pseudo facts that you can never trust anything an Irish person would say, that they're constantly talking and so on. So, you know, this is something that raises eyebrows, I think, for me, because of the history of the stage Irish stereotype. But it's something that also really interests me because I've done a lot of research on hoaxes in Irish writing. That's one of my main fields of interest. And I'm very interested in how often Irish writing takes advantage of these stereotypes or these assumptions to sort of expose them, put on the mantle or play up the part in order to sort of make fun of the stereotype itself. And so, you know, sometimes I feel like Burgess is getting close to these stereotypes. For example, when he writes that the pages of O'Brien's MA thesis should be properly blank and the examiner is too drunk to notice, which of course is funny. Like, I mean, it made me laugh, but it is also a part of the stereotypical thing of, like, if Flann O'Brien would write an MA thesis, it would have to be a hoax, it would have to be a joke, and the examiners would be too drunk to notice, which is funny, but it's also not true. Like, it's quite a good piece of scholarship. It's quite interesting. His MA thesis combines sort of ideas from like T.S. Eliot and applies, and Ezra Pound and modernism applies them to early Irish representations of nature. He's very interested in the non-anthropocentric representation of nature. It's quite a serious work. So there's an assumption that's not founded there, but I do see where it comes from. But at other points, I really think Burgess gets beyond this kind of essentialist rhetoric of the Irish bull or the Irish fact, and he gets at some really interesting and insightful ideas and observations through this. So a lot of early Flann O'Brien scholarship was sort of bogged down by this idea that he had this anxiety of influence with regard to Joyce. A lot of 20th century writing about O'Brien treats him as a second-hand, inferior Joyce. He's kind of imitating Joyce, which to my mind is very narrow and restrictive and doesn't notice the ways in which O'Brien has many other influences and also is sort of mocking Joyce in many moments. But here Burgess argues that there isn't this anxiety of influence. If there's commonality between them, it's because Joyce and O'Brien are both Irish, that there's another source that's common to them both, that they're both drawing on. And he describes this as this heteroglossia of different styles. So what Burgess identifies, I'm going to quote from the piece here now, as what's commonly Irish about Joyce and O'Brien is, quote, the collocation of varying styles, mock heroic, deadpan, educated, shabby, genteel, low Dublin, and so on. And here I think Burgess notices something that I find interesting about this type of writing, which is both its hoaxing quality, that it's not through a kind of essentialist sense of an inability to tell the truth, but there's politics involved in this slipperiness for marginal writing or colonized writers. And it also has this kind of heteroglossic quality, right? This combination of different voices and styles, which is quite Carnivalesque. And I think that gets to some of the politics, seriousness of this position. This Irishness is its Carnivalesque quality.
Burgess's anxiety of influence around Joyce is quite profound as well. And I wonder if this is part of where he's getting what he's saying about all this from.
I'm interested in that. So, because what I find interesting is that Burgess denies an anxiety of influence with O'Brien. But are you suggesting that he does that as an extension of denying his own anxiety of influence with Joyce? Because he can't put that, in his own case, he can't put that down to a common Irishness.
No, although Burgess would claim quite a lot of Irishness, more than you might expect. He writes in various places about he himself has this kind of Irish Catholic quality that, and this is what really informs, his approach to literature and his sensibilities and all that kind of thing. So he sort of leans into it. And it's because of his admiration of Joyce, his kind of, the influence that Joyce has had on him. It's not that he tries to escape necessarily, but it's something that he grapples with, let's put it that way, over the course of his writing career. This is a whole other subject, though, that takes us away from O'Brien, but I just wonder if Burgess's writing about O'Brien is informed by his own relationship with Joyce, this kind of monetary figure that looms in his own hinterland.
I mean, this is really interesting. I mean, I'd certainly defer to you on matters of Burgess and what Burgess thought and what he did. But what it does sound like to me that he is claiming a common sensibility, like that Burgess is placing himself in this tradition, which he identifies here as stern to Joyce, to O'Brien, right? That there's this kind of tradition of anti-realist, metafictional, humorous writing, which is whimsical, but there's a purposefulness to it that can be quite political, I suppose, as well. And maybe Burgess is placing himself into this tradition. And so in that sense, not so much an essentialist idea of Irishness, but an idea of Irishness as a collection of sensibilities, of attitudes, of genres, and perhaps this kind of heteroglossic combination of mock versions of more authoritative genres, so not speaking in the heroic voice, but the mock heroic voice and things like this.
Yeah, Burgess kind of claims kin, I suppose, with these writers. He wouldn't put himself in their world quite, but except when it suits him, actually. And so Burgess does ventriloquize Joyce in his stage version of Ulysses Blooms of Dublin. He tries to articulate his own version of Irishness, I suppose, through some of his own writing.
But do you see any instance of A Swim to Birds influence on Burgess's style or his voice or his sensibilities?
I'm not so sure about that. I think that probably takes it a little bit too far. Having said that, though, Burgess is very positive. He writes glowingly, really, about O'Brien and particularly about this work. Tracing the influence directly, I think I wouldn't like to do that in this conversation. I think I'd have to think about that further. But I certainly think your idea of putting himself in that story, I think, is really important for Burgess.
Yeah, because he treats O'Brien differently than he treats Joyce. Like, I mean, as much as he is positive in those pieces, he is also holding this novel at arm's length. Like, he is saying that it's a kind of a bauble, it's a kind of a whimsical book on some level, and that he admires that, but I think he clearly doesn't hold it in the regard that he holds Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses. And I think he misses something in this, but then of course there's also something to this too.
I think there are parallels too in Burgess's biography. You know, Burgess worked for the Colonial Office. Burgess was a civil servant himself, and his early novels draw on that experience quite directly. I wonder if there are comparisons to be made.
If anybody listening would like to tease these out, we're always open to submissions at the Journal of Flann O'Brien Studies.
That's excellent to hear. Let's move on to talk about some of the other writers that we've already touched on a little bit, but perhaps we could extend that somewhat. You've already mentioned Lawrence Sterne as being part of this story. Burgess also mentioned Rabelais as a point of comparison. I wondered how useful you felt those comparisons were, or whether there were any other big ones we could pick out to talk about in relation to At Swim Two Birds.
I mean, I think they're very useful. I think they're very astute. I mean, in terms of Sterne, I suppose we would have to think of Tristram Shandy's very digressive, recursive structure, this idea of a novel that never gets started because it keeps going back, is quite similar, I suppose, to the opening of At Swim Two Birds, which declares that one beginning and one ending for a novel is something I was never satisfied with. Novels should have 3 openings and 100 times as many endings. And obviously the book has these 3 openings and these 3 endings. And there's this sort of failure to progress very often. So we've described the plot here, and I think it makes it probably sound like there's a lot of action. But one of the recurring jokes of At Swim Two Birds is that the author keeps losing parts of the manuscript where all the exciting stuff happens, and they're just sort of referenced. And what we're left is with a lot of these very dull conversations among the characters hanging around the Red Swan Hotel about how the Irishman is the greatest jumper in the world, or how to play the violin and stuff. So that's very like Tristram Shandy, I think. This sense of never getting to the destination, always getting bogged down in these digressions and these side plots. And the humor that's inherent to that, I think, is common between them. The comparison to Rabelais is even more thought-provoking, in my view. I mean, obviously, we think about Rabelais as a writer of exuberance and parody and exaggeration and invention. And At Swim Two Birds clearly fits into this style of writing, this tone and this mode. But I think it's also Rabelaisian in this sense of what Michael Bakhtin calls the Carnivalesque. So by the Carnivalesque, what I mean is that At Swim Two Birds combines the high, so the high literature manifested in sort of Joycean high modernism, high medieval Irish poetry, with the low, which in the book takes the form of body humor, this kind of everyday banal conversations about the best way to treat boils, this type of thing we've been talking about. And I would say that this undermining of the high with the low is what makes the comparison with Rabelais instructive, and also reveals something about the comedy and the politics of At Swim Two Birds. Because this is what Bakhtin writes about the Carnivalesque. It's that it's this upside down world. It's this inversion of social hierarchy that's made transgressive through this kind of radical laughter at official voices, official narratives, focusing on the body and defecation and things like this rather than the intellect. And this is really on display in the book, I think. It's resonant, although he doesn't really make it explicit in his piece. I think Burgess's idea of it being this heteroglossia of different voices and comparing it to Rabelais picks out this idea of the book. And I would say it's also part of its kind of hoaxing aesthetic, this mimicking the official voices of the state. So you see this in the mock trial at the end of the book and things like this, but rendering them ridiculous through profanity and these kind of comic crownings and uncrownings and things like this, I think is what makes it really interesting. I mean, you talk about other writers. I mean, there's so many, he's very influenced by James Stephen's book, A Crock of Gold. That's a big influence on the book. And then he's obviously very influenced by Joyce and other people of this ilk.
Going back to what you were saying about the Carnivalesque, the upside down world, and Burgess doesn't quite frame it in that way, but he does talk about the playful nature of O'Brien's writing. Well, this is what he says. He says the aim of all the writing is ludic. It's to disturb through the playing of games. Only fools like ministers of the interior take the world seriously with what results we know. And I suppose what he's saying there is that these inversions, this playfulness, this is what gives O'Brien's work a serious intent. This enables his satire to have some kind of purchase. I wondered what you made of that idea, really. Is O'Brien, is he just whimsical? Does he have more to say? Or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I think it was also this quote that made me think about the Carnivalesque in combination with Burgess's idea that the shared Irishness of Joyce and O'Brien is their combination of these different mock versions of genres and the connection with Rabelais. It was also this quote that you just quoted here about how only fools like the ministers of the interior take the world seriously. Because this is what Bakhtin writes about Rabelais and about Carnivalesque culture. He says that, I'm going to quote from Bakhtin here, I have it in front of me. The serious aspects of class culture are official and authoritarian. They're combined with violence, prohibitions, limitations, and always contain an element of fear and intimidation. It was the victory of laughter over fear that most impressed medieval man. It was not only a victory over the mystic terror of God, but also over the oppression and guilt related to all that was consecrated and forbidden. It was the defeat of divine and human power, of authoritarian command. So I think Burgess is articulating a version of this idea, right? When he says that only the interiors of the ministry, the serious aspects of class culture are speaking the serious voice, which has inherent to it these kinds of forms of violence and prohibition. And that the way to counter this is not by matching its seriousness or its violence, but by inverting it through this kind of comic approach to the world and this idea of a political but even philosophical meaning of folk laughter, which allows us to see the world anew, to reveal an unofficial truth and all this kind of thing. And I think part of the seriousness of the humor in the book. And there's been a lot of really interesting readings in the last years which have returned it to its political context at the end of the Irish Free State, its transformation into Ireland after the end of the Free State, and how there was this kind of deflation, this sense that this rhetoric that Ireland had become independent, which was undermined by the fact that it carried over so many colonial legal structures and cultural affectations and attitudes towards Irish life itself, that I think he's mocking and making fun of. Like, for example, having in the show trial, the uncrowning of Trellis, the author, and so on. And so there is a seriousness to this playfulness. But I think also Burgess's sort of emphasis on the idea that the book is whimsical and playful also paints over the fact that the humor of the book is very much a gallows humor. And it's with a lot of focus on body humor. So sex, vomiting, stench, drunkenness. That's very grotesque at times, but also very violent. I mean, I've already mentioned that there's a scene of rape in the novel, which is rendered absurd because it's an author raping his character, but it doesn't make it any less unsettling. And the novel ends with this very stark 180 shift in tone with this image of suicide. And that's a very disturbing, as well as strangely comic scene. And I think this is characteristic of O'Brien's novels, different from his broader, more popular column writing, his writing for the stage, is that it can be very unsettling in its comic vision and in its tone. It's a comedy that seeks to unsettle rather than to comfort. And in that way, even at times when the satire is not too difficult to access, it seems to be doing something effective that's more than this. And I think that this is part of the abrasiveness of the novel and the seriousness of it as well as. it being silly because, of course, you have a talking cow giving evidence in a trial is patently silly, and we're supposed to laugh, and we do. But it's mixed with these darker tones, I think, which makes the book quite interesting and unique in some ways.
Let's bring At Swim Two Birds up to date. And you're very involved in contemporary Flann O'Brien studies. I wondered what you thought the current readership for this novel and Flann O'Brien's other work was like, and indeed, are there any writers working today who you think have been influenced by O'Brien?
So, I mean, there's been several waves, I would say, in O'Brien's reception and the reception of this book. So, really, very interestingly, one of the first people to review the book when it first came out was Borges. And he put it in this tradition that we kind of see Burgess putting it into also, this tradition of books that are metafictional, blending different frames and ontological levels. So he compares it to Don Quixote, The Golden Ass, Hamlet's The Mousetrap, things like this. And I would say in the first wave of its reception, people's idea was that the book was mostly influential on postmodern fiction that attempts to do similar things, to blend these different ontological levels and frames and have no floor of reference. It's just this kind of mise en abîme of play with words and language. And these would be books like Italo Calvino's Ivana Winter's Night of Traveller, or B.S. Johnson's Travelling People, or Gilbert Sorrentino's Mulligan Stew, or Alistair Gray's fiction, perhaps Lanark in particular, Danielewski's House of Leaves. This is sort of the idea that Flann O'Brien was this kind of lonely postmodernist who influenced a lot of these later postmodern experimentations, it's kind of ludic novels. So we set up the International Flann O'Brien Society in 2011 to mark his centenary, and since then, I think there's been a second wave with second sort of idea or attention to his writing, which I think a lot of it has been more historicist, I would say, like returning it to its Irish contexts. And that I think has been, I'm not saying that the academic work has been influential in this way, but it's part of a bigger turn against this kind of reading these people in isolation and purely formalist terms. And this idea of O'Brien as an Irish writer, has someone who has something to say about contemporary Irish culture and politics and aesthetics, which is also, I guess, what Burgess is alluding to. I think you see his influence on people like Kevin Barry or Julian Gough, but also darkly comic, violent representations of violence like Anna Burns's Milkman, I think has the influence of O'Brien, perhaps in some of these qualities I was just discussing, and very much in contemporary Irish political art that's beyond literature. So, for example, Blind Boy Boat Club from the Rubber Bandits, Flann O'Brien's huge influence on him. Kneecap, whose new movie is just out. They definitely call on O'Brien to sort in this kind of formation of what we could call like a new kind of Carnivalesque political comedy in contemporary Ireland. And, in the course of the society, we've had lots of authors speak at events who are very influenced by O'Brien that might surprise you. So someone like Joanna Walsh, for example, who writes, this amazing short realist, but moving out to ludic kind of short stories and so on. She's quite influenced by O'Brien in a lot of ways. And I know through the Society's work, there's a larger academic interest in him. I think one of the reasons why that he's more widely read in that context is because he used to be excluded because of his Irishness, but also because of the fact that he only was thought of as writing one or two good novels, and that he moved into writing for newspapers, writing for TV, writing for radio, considered lesser media and genres. But nowadays, because of the advent of new modernism and sort of rethinking the era, beyond kind of isolated figures like Joyce or Beckett, he has sort of taken center stage as a writer who writes in all of these different modern genres, these different voices, these different modes. He suddenly seems like a very much of his time modern writer. And, he continues to be very popular. I think in some ways he's more popularly read than someone like Joyce. He's still quite often adapted for the stage and for film. And I think people continue to find something that speaks to the present moment in the uniqueness of his comedy and the experimentation of his modes and his sort of way of trying to negotiate this difference between the past and the present and these different voices and how they weave together.
To finish off, as you know, Burgess picked 99 novels for his selection, so we're asking everyone participating in this series to add a 100th novel to that list. What would it be for you and why?
There's a lot of great novels, lots of things you could pick. I suppose I try to think about some of the gaps in the 99 novels, and one, of course, is a gap of like minor languages. So while we're on the topic of Flann O'Brien, I thought I would nominate his Irish language novel, An Béal Bocht, which is really compelling Irish language satire of the way in which the kind of poverty porn, of the way in which people write about the cultural nationalist romanticization of abject poverty and the way in which it's necessary to hold up a kind of a bourgeois Irish ideal of itself. But I think the novel goes even further than this because it speaks to a lot of contemporary interests, I think, in representations of the non-human and so on, because there's a lot of representations of cohabitation with animals and people turning into animals. And I think it is quite, even though it might seem slight and comic, like A Swim to Birds on its face, I think it actually has some quite radical things to say about ethics of representing the other, as well as just being an extremely funny book. I also wouldn't be the first person to notice that there's not as many women writers on the list as there should be.
Quite so, yeah.
So anybody who kind of enjoys the type of novel I'm describing here, this kind of Carnivalesque, anarchic comic book that is in excess of all good measure, I would add Virginia Woolf's Orlando as a book in the spirit of a book in which people change sex, change form, live across centuries. The book, I think, is very funny and witty and compelling, but also very experimental, and wouldn't be the first pairing you would think of O'Brien and Woolf, given their different sensibilities. But I think that there's something instructive in the way in which they both try to think about a different relationship to history beyond the objective, beyond the calendar, beyond the clock, something that's experiential and comic and carnivalesque. So they're my two. You can pick who you want to, which one you want to add there, Will.
Thank you, Paul. That's great. Two great suggestions there to finish. And thank you for your contribution to the series. It's been great to explore At Swim to Birds and Flann O'Brien with you. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's the pleasure's been all mine. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. Finnegan's Wake, Human and Non-Human Histories, edited by Paul Fagan and Richard Barlow, is out now from Edinburgh University Press. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the free Burgess Foundation newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music for the 99 Novels podcast is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor, performed by the No Dice Collective. Find them online at nodicecollective.com.